Another point that I forgot to mention is located at the bottom of the slide here, nurturance and bodily substance, milk kinship. Have you ever heard of milk kinship before? This is a concept that exists in North Africa and the Middle East um, um, region of the world, along with other places. Milk kinship is the concept that individuals could be understood to be related to one another through ingestion of breast milk that comes from the same woman. So, for example, if there is a woman who breastfeeds two children, these children might be completely unrelated to one another, right? But if the same woman breastfeeds them, then from then on, those children will conceive of themselves as being related to one another. They're milk kin. And those children, those two children, say, could never in the future develop kind of a sexual union or relationship with one another simply because they're conceived of at that point as related. It's almost like having an incestuous relationship with one another. So that's just an interesting example of how varied ideas of kinship can be from one society to another. So again, as I just said, kinship systems vary from one society to another, but there are some things that all societies share in terms of, generally speaking, this idea of kinship, right? All societies have some idea of kinship, some idea of family, some idea of relatedness. And what does this do? Well, in all societies, kinship allows for us to distinguish between different kinds of kin and to be able to articulate their roles, rights, and obligations. So, for example, what is the role of the mother's brother? Right, a mother's brother, for ego, for an individual, will have very different roles and expectations connected with that title from one society to another. Same goes for any other kinship, term or title, right? Kinship systems, a term where people live after marriage. We will talk about that in this unit. It also determines to whom goods and resources will flow after marriage. Think land rights, ownership, and inheritance. This is something that is incredibly important, say, in a society where, maybe, let's say, a horticultural society or a pastoral society, maybe they inherit cattle, right, from the individual. This is important in a society where, say, cash is not kept in a bank account, but simply in kind of the resource is the land or is the cattle. During the harvest period, that's when you get cash, and then you just spend that throughout the course of the year. So it's a big deal, this last part, in terms of inheritance rules. Okay, so what is kinship? Well, let's go back to our good old friend, Lewis Henry Morgan, the anthropologist who worked among Iroquois communities in upstate New York. You should remember him in terms of this concept of cultural evolutionism, which we talked about earlier in the course. He's actually considered the founder of kinship studies. So as I said earlier, he spent a lot of time studying technology within Iroquois communities, but also studying kinship terms within those societies. He did the sort of kinship chart that I showed earlier a few slides ago, those complicated charts with triangles and circles, to map out, right, how it is that different individuals related to one another in these communities in indigenous communities in upstate New York. And he kind of provided the model for early anthropologists who, again, as they went to study societies that had previously therefore not been studied by anthropologists, they went in to try to explain how people related to one another because they thought that they needed to know something about those social relations before they could dive into understanding religion, understanding gender relations, that sort of thing. Again, they sort of thought of kinship as the building blocks for a society. And there's some truth to that. Just a warning, this unit will have a lot of vocab terms that you will need to learn. So I'm happy to, answer any questions that you might have about any of these particular terms. So as a reminder for today's course, we were to have watched The Women's Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed watching that film. I'd like for us to spend some time now kind of unpacking that film. First, I have a question for you. What are walking marriages? That's the focus of the film. And I have a Google Doc activity for you to complete as it relates to this in terms of the effects of walking marriages. So if your last name begins with A through and including F, you're going to focus on the role of mother's brother. Tell me, us, the other students, bullet point, what is the role of the mother's brother in Moso society? G through L, you're going to focus on the role of the father. Right? What is the role of the biological father in this society, his relationship to children, etc.? M through R, inheritance and distribution of wealth. This is slightly less covered in the film, but do your best. How do you think that inheritance or wealth is distributed among most of the people? And S through Z, tell me about women as authority figures in the society. I'm also going to encourage you to listen to this NPR story about tourism among the Mosul. And in your notes, I'd like you to reflect upon the role of tourism and what role has that played in local kinship structures, again, among the Mosul in China. So go ahead and pause that video, and please, in the Google Doc, fill out this question about walking marriages. Once you've finished, listen to the NPR story, and in your own notes, answer this question. What role has tourism played in changing local kinship structures? Okay, so I'm going to continue now and just add a few points here. I think it's important to note that outsiders, these tourists, right, who are coming to view, to observe the Mosul, many of them are largely ethnic Han, H-A-N. This is the ethnic majority in China. And they view these walking marriages as quote unquote weird or quote unquote primitive, right? And many of the male tourists are coming to take advantage of Mosul women. You heard that in the radio piece. The fact that they think of walking marriages as primitive or weird means that they are thinking about these in a way that is what term would we use in anthropology? That is ethnocentric, correct, right? And matrilineality in this society really functions as a way of keeping money within the family line, right? Keeping money within that tight matrilineal unit. It doesn't end up becoming distributed equally between the mother and the father of this child, but it continues to stay within the mother's side. Okay, but as you've heard in that radio piece, now with tourism and increased capital, meaning money coming into these communities from tourism, there's less of an economic need to pool resources. And so it's somewhat unclear to what extent matrilineal kinship practices will continue among the Mosul in the future. Okay. So I have a few terms for you. First, bilateral descent. This is when kinship relationships are constructed through both the mother's and father's lines. Okay. In other words, this is the kinship system that most of us North Americans use, right? In other words, when I ask you who is your family, you let's say you have a mother or father, or let's say you have two guardians, right, of any sex. You might think that of your family as being, right, all those people on either side of that tree, right? However, some societies use unilineal descent, and in a unilineal descent system, kinship relationships are constructed through either the mother's line or either the father's line, but not both. Okay. In this case, for in unilineal descent societies, the vast majority of them are patrilineal. By this, I mean that in patrilineal societies, If I was to ask someone who's in a patrilineal society, hey, who's your family? Who's in your family? They will probably first list off, and maybe even only list off, their father's family. Right? On the other hand, in a matrilineal society, descent is understood through the mother's line. Okay. So the Musua is an example of this, right? When they think about family, right, someone who is Musua, they're going to think about their mother and her family. Now, it's important to note that not all societies have a sperm and egg notion of conception, but also, more broadly, this unit on kinship allows me to reinforce the idea that even those things that we think of as biological fact and just truth in Western societies, we tend to think of, science as just something that's fact. Cultural anthropologists who work on the topic of science have often shown that, of course, science is also influenced by culture. Why is that? Because science uses language. We use language to describe our scientific findings, and language itself is always cultural and loaded with cultural bias. Let me give you an example. Anthropologist Emily Martin in the late 80s and early 90s showed how American culture often framed the sperm and egg notion of conception in highly gendered terms. She studied high school biology textbooks in the United States. These textbooks described female reproductive cycles as involving, quote, debris and, quote, tissue death. It often framed the egg and female reproductive cycles more generally in negative terms, problematic terms. On the other hand, male reproductive processes, in particular the journey of the sperm to the egg, were framed in positive terms, in terms of wonder. Sperm were described as, quote, brave or, quote, heroic, as, quote, saving the egg, end quote, from its own destruction. As we know, however, sometimes it takes more than one sperm to fertilize an egg. Sometimes the first sperm to arrive isn't actually the one that fertilizes the egg. But more importantly, as far as we know, right, sperm do not have personalities, right, or can't necessarily be heroic or brave. Right? Why is this important? What does this tell us? Well, of course, it shows that these textbooks, science, are simply reflecting the cultural values, particularly at that time in the late 80s and early 90s, when American society was arguably even more sexist than it is today, right? And thus something that we might think of as natural, neutral, like the science of human reproduction, is in fact not neutral at all. It too is informed by culture. I'm going to give a very specific example now. Let's turn to the Turkana people of East Africa. And many East African societies, in fact, they conceptualize, again, I'm speaking specifically to, say, folks in rural parts of Kenya, Turkana people in rural Kenya who, have not yet been influenced by or are less influenced by, Western biological explanations for human reproduction. They will understand reproduction as involving dad's semen and mom's blood, right? Not necessarily, any other body part other than simply her blood, and that's what produces an infant. But actually, it's even more complicated than that. For the Turkana, dad's material, so dad's biological material and all that his side of his family represents, will materialize in the child's bones, in the hard parts of the child's body, literally their bones. But the soft part of the child, say their flesh, right, skin, muscle, that comes from their mom's blood, and so the mom's side of the family. So what's so fascinating here is that a child, an individual, will actually associate certain body parts with certain parts of their family tree. It's incredibly complicated and arguably even more complex than the way we think of, reproduction generally kind of in the West. Okay. Now, A few more terms for you. Consanguineal kin. These are relationships by blood. If any of you speak or have learned French, for example, you know sang, which means blood, is right in that word, consanguineal kin, relationships by blood. Affinal kin, these are relations by marriage. So we sometimes make this distinction in the West between relationships by blood versus by marriage. For example, like that's my aunt by marriage or my aunt by, well, I'd say aunt by marriage, for example, right? It's almost a way of distancing. Oh, that's my uncle by marriage, right? Not like I'm not biologically related to him, right? But what's interesting is that David Schneider was one of the first anthropologists to make this argument that the way we talk about by blood or by marriage, that way we talk and think about kinship, is not a cross-cultural universal. In other words, not all cultures think about kinship that way. It's a very Euro-American way of thinking about kinship, right? So anthropologists had long been talking about kinship in terms of consanguineal kin and affinal kin. And Schneider comes in and says, wait a second, anthropologists, when you say those things, you're actually just reinforcing your own Western ideas about kinship, which makes this distinction between kin by blood versus kin by marriage. But actually, that's not universal. Some cultures do not make that sort of distinction. And so that's important to us as anthropologists, as cultural anthropologists, because we always want to make sure that we're not importing our cultural ideas and bias and placing them on some other culture. Okay, I will continue the next portion of lecture into the next section.